Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Hereditary. This film was directed by Ari Aster. He made a series of short films leading up to this film, which is his first feature-length film, which I think is pretty remarkable. And this movie generated a lot of buzz when it first premiered at Sundance. A lot of critics were saying this is one of the scariest horror films in years, one of the best horror films of this generation. A horror film that is refreshing in a genre that can often get very tired because it's a genre that is very susceptible to a lot of cliches. A lot of that is because horror tends to be very dynamic. It is very rooted in its style and conventions, and a lot of the imagery that is meant to shock, that is meant to terrify, it's hard to get out of your head, and it's hard to be original because of that. I don't like to buy into hype like that. When people say it's the scariest movie ever made, naturally I'm gonna be skeptical, and I'm gonna go into the movie already having that high expectation, so I try to kind of avoid that. And I will say, after having seen it and processing it a little bit, it does not disappoint. It really is a very good film. I won't go so far as to say it's that original, per se, because it does follow a lot of the same story beats and the same tropes that we know, but I will say that it is bold stylistically. It is very atmospheric, extremely intense as well, and off-kilter, and it's got some humor in it that you may not expect at times, and I think overall just a very solid piece of filmmaking. And for somebody with as little experience as this director, it pleases me to see somebody going all in on their first film, somebody who knows who they are artistically, and they know their point of view, and they know precisely how to get that across. That often takes a lot of artists, a lot of filmmakers, years to master, and he already has it. This film, if I'm going to get into the plot, I don't want to talk too much about it, but I will say on a basic level, you have Annie, who is the main character played by Toni Collette, and she is an artist who makes these little miniature models of houses, of scenes, and a lot of them seem to be ones that come from her life, the events that happen in her life. She lives in a very beautiful house. She has a husband and 2 children, and when the movie opens, we are opening with death. We are opening with a funeral for Annie's mother, who has just passed away. And after her death, the entire family starts to experience very strange occurrences, all of these very supernatural events. And in order to understand and figure out what is happening to her family, Annie kind of ends up uncovering all of this surprising stuff that comes out about her mother that she didn't know. And the secret history that her mother has is contributing to a lot of these horrific events that keep happening. As I said, the movie does follow a lot of tropes that we know, and I think it is definitely rooted in a lot of the horror classics that you know, from the past. I think that we're already seeing people comparing it to The Exorcist, which I think is of course natural. But for me, more than that, I would say a huge influence would be Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, which if you watch this film, the more it unfolds, the more you realize how similar they are. And it also just reminds me a lot of some of the late 70s, early 80s horror films. A big one is Don't Look Now. And also, you know, I gotta say The Shining. Maybe not as much as some of the other ones, but there's definitely the influence. I think that this film, above all, has that Polanski-esque quality that we do see in movies like Repulsion and Rosemary's Baby, in that it's very unsettling, yet eccentric at the same time. Like, there's something that's very off-kilter about the humor in it, and that makes it unexpected. It makes it very unique. And it's that sort of thing that just makes you feel uncomfortable. It sort of settles into your blood and into your bones like there's some sort of mold inside you. It also has that kind of Kubrickian influence, what we saw with The Shining, just in terms of that slow build, of course. And then, you know, there is a lot of humor amidst all of the horror in The Shining as well. And I think that humor and terror work together so well because they are both kind of extreme emotions on the emotional spectrum that can easily be blurred. With this film, it's the bravura that sticks out to me, what makes this movie so striking. And what I like in horror is when you can feel every moment. I did say this movie is atmospheric, and I think that is so important because oftentimes that's very hard to pull off. With this, every scene, every single moment, every image just sticks with you, and it kind of encompasses the overall meaning of the film. And aesthetically, this film is so impressive. I think it's in the details. Every single room, the props, just the mise-en-scene in general just contributes to the tension. It's like, you know, like I mentioned about Polanski, this film just has a quality about it where you feel very immersed in the world. You feel immersed in the family drama. You can almost smell the rooms in the house, and you can feel kind of the dust on the tables. You feel every jolt, every sound has a sort of texture to it, and to me that is essential in the horror genre. And the surrealism, the way they go about exploring the surrealism and how they use that to manipulate the audience is very impressive to me as well. Every scene surprises you in terms of the way that it's shot, the way that the scenes are cut. And because of that, you're not sure what is real, what might be happening in a character's mind. Everything feels like jumbled. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it just kind of leaves the movie in this sort of fog. Everything sort of weaves together in this very bizarre sort of tapestry that, again, you don't really understand until you can see it once it's finished. And I know I sound like a broken record because every horror movie review that I do, I mention this, but I really can't help it. It has to be said because I think that it is the most important thing. It is what separates the bad horror films from the really good ones. But it is how the paranormal elements and the surrealist aspects of the movie, how they contribute to the paranoia, the internal paranoia that the characters feel. How they feel, of course, is very important, and it's going to resonate with us because they are human, and of course we are human as well. And that gives it substance. That gives us a chance to really pick apart what really terrifies us on a deeper level. Oftentimes, when I talk to different people about the movies that they are most scared of, you can see a trend with each one. It reveals your deepest insecurities and your deepest vulnerabilities in a way that you may not necessarily be aware of until you really analyze it. And that's why I love analyzing horror films and parts of history in terms of horror, just because I think it's a very psychological genre. Even if the movie itself isn't necessarily that deep, I think we can pull a lot away from it in terms of what excites us or what scares us as audience members. And because of that, it becomes very psychological. Like, if I talk about a lot of my favorite horror movies, I'm sure it will say a lot about me. It's kind of like, it's like therapy. And with this film, it's pretty obvious. The paranoia is derived from the title of the movie. And the title of this movie is Hereditary. And this movie is about what we inherit from our parents and how we don't want to be like our parents a lot of the time. We don't want to make the same mistakes that they did raising us, but naturally, whenever we go on to have families of our own or go on to have relationships, whatever, we realize we make a lot of the same mistakes that they do. And then there's that inherent guilt because of it, because it is so personal, that ancestry, that familial binding. And that familial symbolism is something that I think most people can agree with. It resonates with us. And, that's another thing that we see in The Shining, for example. That's a movie where the generational divide and the ancestry of what we pass on from one generation to the next is very integral to what makes that film have such meaning. The Annie character, played wonderfully by Toni Collette, I think one of our most reliable actresses. She is a perfect manifestation of this symbolism. This is a woman that we realize pretty early on is somebody who is maybe a little bit unstable, somebody that is very affected by her family life growing up, and a lot of the trauma she's experienced has tainted her in ways where she does feel that guilt. She may feel some disdain being a mother and passing a lot of what she knew onto her kids. Maybe it led her to going down certain avenues that she wasn't ready for, and it's caused her to make some mistakes that maybe she didn't intend. She definitely projects a lot of her own anger onto her children, and yet there's also this sort of love and possessiveness. So it's a strange relationship, but I would say what is most complicated is the relationship between her and her son Peter, and when you watch the movie, you'll realize why. For me, that is the crux of the movie, is the relationship between Annie and Peter and just that family bond in general. And I think one of the interesting metaphors, and maybe I haven't heard this talked about much at all, but for me, one that really stuck out to me is what Annie does as a job, her vocation. The idea of her being an artist is an interesting metaphor. The opening shot is awesome in this movie. We see her workspace and we see all of the little pieces as she's building her little miniature models, and we see a model of her own house, and we zoom into it, and then it becomes the real house, and we see Peter in his room. We zoom into his room, and he wakes up and he's preparing for the funeral, for his grandmother's funeral. And I think that's an interesting metaphor to kind of peel apart. And of course, everyone is going to interpret it in their own way. But for me, yeah, it reminds me of The Shining, and I'm realizing as I'm talking that maybe this movie has more in common with The Shining than I originally thought. For me, it is very reminiscent of that spectacular shot where Jack is in the hotel and he's kind of looking down at that miniature model of the maze. And it's as if he's looking down at his son and his wife as they're playing. It's a very strange moment, and we're obviously seeing something from Jack's point of view in one way. And in this movie, we're seeing this from Annie's point of view. It could be a metaphor for the artistic process in a lot of ways, how we kind of work through our demons through artistic sensibilities. And that also kind of ties the creative process of the protagonist and the director together, which is always very important, and it becomes a very meta sort of thing. And with Annie, you know, she's making these models, and she does say in the movie that it's meant to be a neutral view. It's a bird's eye view of everything that's happening. But I also think it's just the idea that this is her life, and she, through all of this work, is getting to examine it. She's coming to terms with it, and she also, through that, has to find the tools in order to work through the demons, to work through all of the horror that is happening around her. And the starting point would be the miniatures there. And there are a lot of things like that in this movie, a lot of little symbols like that that are very interesting. And this movie is very detailed, so I want to go back and watch it and see what little symbols and things I didn't pick up on the first time. So I'm sure you can probably tell that I really liked this movie, and I do, as I said, I think it's very well made. It's fiercely bold, and staccato is a good word I like to use. And perhaps it is less original than maybe I think it's been sold as, but it's an admirable piece of work, and yeah, see it. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.